It was a cold Monday morning in November, the kind that made city buildings look even grayer, and the sky feel a little too heavy. Julian Hart, the CEO of Hartwell Industries, had just poured his first black coffee of the day when the knock came. 3 soft, deliberate taps at the tall glass door of his penthouse suite. Unusual. The security in the building was tight. No one got up here unless they were on a list. Julian set the cup down slowly, curious. He walked over, expecting a delivery mishap, or perhaps a neighbor, but when he opened the door, what he saw made him freeze. A man stood there, holding the hand of a little boy. The man was in his mid-30s, with tired eyes and the kind of stubble that spoke of rushed mornings and skipped meals. His clothes were clean but worn, a dark hoodie, jeans, and a backpack slung over one shoulder. The boy, maybe 6 or 7, had dark curls and soft brown eyes that immediately caught Julian's breath in his throat. "Mr. Hart?" the man asked, his voice low, polite. Julian nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm sorry to show up like this," the man said, glancing down at the boy, then back up, his voice almost trembling. "But I believe your son is actually mine." Julian blinked, confused. I don't have a son." The man gently pushed the boy a little forward. "His name is Micah. He's 7. Your ex-wife, Elise. She told me I wasn't the father when she left. But a few weeks ago, she passed away, and I found proof. A letter, a test. She lied." Julian's chest tightened. Elise. The name felt like a scar that never quite healed. She'd been gone from his life for nearly 7 years, walking out without explanation, heavily pregnant, and refusing any further contact. He had searched for her for a while, but eventually, she disappeared completely. "Wait," Julian said, stepping back slightly. "You're saying, this boy is Elise's son?" "Yes," the man replied, "and I was there when he was born. I raised him, but she told me, swore, I was the father. I loved him, I still do, but I found the truth. You're his biological father." Julian looked down at the boy, Micah, who clutched a small stuffed fox in one hand and looked up with quiet curiosity. "Why are you here?" Julian asked, gently, "Because I didn't know what else to do." The man said, "Micah deserves the truth, and maybe he deserves you, too." Julian's world shifted. Everything stable. The company, the routines, the carefully managed life, felt like it was tipping. He didn't know what to say. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. "I'm not here to dump him," the man added quickly. "I'm not giving him away. I love this boy. I need you to know, and I need to figure out what's right for him." Julian slowly crouched down to Micah's level. "Hi," he said, forcing a soft smile. Micah didn't respond. He just hugged the fox tighter and looked away. "His name's Daniel," the man said. "I'm Daniel Rivera." Julian nodded. "You should come in." It was supposed to be just another Monday, but with one knock on the door, everything changed. If this story is touching your heart already, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more emotional stories, and share it with someone who needs a little light today. Julian led Daniel and Micah inside slowly, still trying to process the weight of what had just been dropped on his doorstep. The penthouse, all glass and polished wood, suddenly felt too big, too sterile for what was unfolding. He cleared a stack of papers from the marble kitchen island and gestured toward the sofa. "You can sit, if you want," Julian said. Daniel hesitated before leading Micah to the edge of the couch. The little boy sat without a word, legs dangling off the edge, his gaze roaming over the unfamiliar surroundings. Julian poured another cup of coffee for himself and offered one to Daniel, who shook his head. Julian took a sip, trying to anchor himself with the bitterness. "So," Julian started, leaning against the counter, "you said Elise is gone." Daniel nodded slowly. "Car accident. 3 weeks ago. It was late, rainy. She was driving. Alone." A strange silence hung in the air. Not grief exactly, not shock. Just the strange emptiness that came from hearing a name from the past and realizing it was no longer tied to a living person. "She left you when she was pregnant," Daniel continued. "You never knew about him." Julian shook his head. "We broke up badly. She didn't want anything from me. No contact, no explanation, just gone." Daniel looked down at his hands, which were calloused and steady despite everything. "She showed up at my place not long after, said she needed someone, said the baby was mine. I believed her. Why wouldn't I?" "And the letter?" Julian asked. "What exactly did it say?" Daniel reached into his backpack and pulled out a crumpled envelope. carefully opening it. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper and a photocopy of a DNA test. He handed it over with quiet reluctance. Julian read it once, then again. There it was, in Elise's handwriting. A confession. I lied to protect myself. And to protect Micah. I thought he'd be safer with Daniel, not growing up in the chaos I left behind. But I was wrong to lie. The test confirmed it. Julian Hart was Micah's biological father. He swallowed hard and sat down, the leather couch sighing under his weight. And Micah doesn't know yet? Julian asked. Daniel shook his head. He knows something's off, that she's gone, that I've been quiet. But I haven't told him the rest. Not yet. Julian looked at the boy again. Micah was quietly thumbing the ear of his fox plushie. He had Elise's mouth. Julian's eyes. The realization hit with a strange ache. He's beautiful, Julian said softly. Daniel gave a small smile. He is smart, too. Loves dinosaurs and drawing. Has this weird obsession with outer space. Julian let the silence sit for a moment. So what now? Daniel looked up. I don't know. That's the thing. I didn't come here with a plan. I didn't come to give him away. I came because I thought you should know. He deserves to know. But also because I've hit a wall. Emotionally, financially, I'm trying. But being a single dad is hard. Julian nodded slowly, the words settling into him. He'd never had to raise a child. Never had to juggle school runs and doctor visits, meals, bedtime stories. He'd built empires, managed crisis after crisis. But this was different. You work? Julian asked. I used to be a teacher, Daniel replied. But I've been doing delivery gigs since Elise got sick a few years ago. Everything shifted. She was in and out of hospitals. I had to be with Micah. He has no one else. Julian looked around his penthouse again. It was full of expensive things. But right now, it all felt hollow. Look, Julian said slowly, I don't know how this is supposed to go. But I want to get to know him. If you're open to it. Daniel's shoulders relaxed just slightly. I was hoping you'd say that. They sat in silence for a moment, the three of them, the CEO, the single dad, and the little boy caught in between, surrounded by glass walls and unanswered questions. Julian glanced at Micah again and asked, gently, hey, buddy, do you like pancakes? Micah looked up for the first time, cautious, but curious. With blueberries, Julian smiled. Yeah, with lots of blueberries. Micah gave the tiniest nod. Cool, Julian said, standing up. I'll make some. As Julian moved to the kitchen, something quiet stirred in his chest. Not panic, not fear, something else, something like hope. The scent of pancakes filled the air, blending awkwardly with the sterile notes of Julian's spotless kitchen. He moved with careful focus, pouring batter onto the hot pan, sprinkling in a few fresh blueberries he happened to have in the fridge, a rare grocery indulgence for someone who usually ate at business dinners or had meals delivered. Behind him, on the couch, Daniel sat beside Micah, quietly watching the boy's tiny legs swing back and forth above the floor. The stuffed fox now rested on the cushion beside him, its fur slightly matted from love. You always make pancakes for strangers? Daniel asked, his tone light, but his eyes watching Julian closely. Julian glanced over his shoulder. Only the ones who bring 7-year-olds. That might be my son. Daniel let out a soft chuckle, and for a moment, the tension that had wrapped itself around the morning eased. There was something about Julian's presence, the way he seemed calm, even when the situation was anything but. Daniel could see the businessman in him, the polished persona, but underneath, there was someone searching to dot. When the pancakes were done, Julian served 3 plates. He placed one in front of Micah carefully, adding a small scoop of whipped cream and an extra drizzle of maple syrup. Hope you like it, sweet, Julian said. Micah stared at the plate for a second, then looked up. Thank you. It was quiet, almost whispered, but sincere. Julian nodded, then took a seat across from them at the kitchen island. They ate, mostly in silence. Micah focused on his pancakes, clearly hungry but shy. Daniel picked at his food, while Julian watched both of them, still trying to make sense of the new reality that had barged into his home when the plates were mostly empty and Micah had started doodling on a napkin with a pen Julian had handed him. Julian cleared his throat. So, what do we do now? He asked, his voice calm, but uncertain. Daniel looked over at Micah, then back at Julian. I don't know. I didn't think this far ahead. I guess we figure it out together. Julian nodded slowly. Okay. He hesitated, then added, I want to spend time with him. Not just because I'm his biological father, but because I missed everything. The first steps, first words. I didn't even know he existed. Daniel's eyes softened. I understand, and I want him to know where he comes from, but he's fragile right now. He doesn't talk about Elise much, not since the funeral. A pang of guilt shot through Julian. He couldn't imagine what the boy must have gone through, losing the only mother he'd ever known, trying to stay strong with a father who was barely holding things together. Would you be okay with us taking it slow? Julian asked. Maybe I could spend time with him, a few hours a week, get to know him. Daniel nodded. Yeah, that would be good. I think he'd like that. Julian smiled gently and looked at Micah, who was now drawing what appeared to be a dinosaur with stars above its head. Hey Micah, Julian said softly. That's a really cool drawing. Micah didn't look up, but he spoke this time, a little louder. It's a T-Rex, but he's dreaming. Julian tilted his head. Dreaming about what? Micah paused, then shrugged. About being on the moon. Daniel chuckled. Told you. Outer space. Julian smiled. That's awesome. You want to maybe show me more of your drawings sometime? Micah gave a tiny nod. Just a flick of his head, but it was enough. Later that afternoon, Daniel packed up their things to go. Before they left, Julian stood at the doorway, hesitant. Do you need anything? He asked quietly. For Micah. School supplies. Clothes. Daniel shook his head at first, pride instinctively leading. Then he stopped and gave a tired sigh. Honestly, yeah, it's been tight. I don't want a handout, but I'll take help for him. Julian nodded. I'll send some things. No strings, just let me do that much. Daniel gave a quiet, grateful smile. Thank you. As they stepped into the hallway, Julian looked at Micah one last time. Hey, buddy, he said. I'd really like to see you again. Maybe next weekend. Micah turned, hugging his fox. Okay, and just like that, the door closed. Julian stood there for a long while, holding the empty coffee cup in his hand, staring at the hallway where they'd disappeared. The silence of the penthouse returned, but this time, it felt less peaceful, less complete. Somehow, in just a few hours, a knock on the door had cracked something open, and for the first time in a long time, Julian wasn't thinking about meetings or numbers or quarterly goals. He was thinking about a little boy who dreamed of dinosaurs on the moon, and the man who raised him with love, even if he wasn't his father by blood. The week passed, more slowly than Julian expected. Meetings blurred together, contracts were signed, and deals were closed, but his mind wasn't in it. Instead of quarterly projections, he thought about Micah. He thought about the way the boy hugged his fox, the quiet way he spoke, the small nods instead of words. He thought about the sadness behind his eyes, a weight too heavy for someone so young. Julian had built his life on control, of timing, of outcomes, of people. But now, something unexpected had cracked that armor, and somehow, he didn't want to fix it. By Saturday morning, Julian found himself standing in the toy aisle of a department store, completely out of his depth. He was dressed sharply, as always, navy wool coat, tailored trousers, and looked comically out of place next to a row of plush dinosaurs and bubble wands. A young employee, maybe 20 at most, approached cautiously. Sir, need help finding something? Julian looked up, mildly embarrassed. Yes, actually, I'm meeting a child, a 7-year-old. First time. He likes dinosaurs and space. I have no idea what I'm doing. The girl grinned. Say no more. We've got the perfect stuff. 15 minutes later, Julian left with a bag full of carefully chosen gifts, a glow-in-the-dark solar system puzzle, a T-Rex hoodie, and a book titled Astrodinos, The Adventures of Rex in Space. He checked his watch. 10:37 a.m. They were supposed to meet at the community park Daniel had chosen. Neutral ground. Casual. Julian arrived early and sat on a bench near the small playground, clutching the bag, his heart thudding louder than he'd admit. He'd given keynote speeches in front of hundreds, testified in courtrooms, negotiated in hostile boardrooms, but this made his palms sweat. And then he saw them. Daniel was walking toward him with Micah, both of them bundled in jackets, Micah's tiny gloved hand tucked in Daniel's larger one. The stuffed fox poked out of Micah's backpack. Julian stood and waved, trying not to look too stiff. Hey, Daniel greeted, smiling slightly. We're not late, are we? No, Julian said, returning the smile. I was just early. Micah looked up at him, eyes curious but unsure. I brought you something, Julian said, crouching to Micah's level and opening the bag. He pulled out the book first. This is about a T-Rex who travels through space. Thought you might like it. Micah took it silently, flipping the cover open. And there's a puzzle too, Julian added. Solar system, glows in the dark. Micah gave a small smile, not big, not wide, but real. Thank you, he said. Julian felt something warm bloom in his chest. You're welcome. They spent the next hour together at the park. Daniel sat on a bench nearby, close enough to observe, far enough to let them find their rhythm. Julian and Micah played with a foam rocket launcher Julian had impulsively bought from a vendor. They read the first few pages of Astrodinos together, and Micah asked thoughtful questions like, do you think dinosaurs would have liked the moon? And if I built a rocket, would it have to be as tall as a building? Julian answered every one. When it was time to leave, Micah looked up at Daniel. Can I come back here again? Daniel met Julian's eyes, searching, then nodded. Yeah, I think we can do that. Julian watched them walk away, Micah skipping a little with the book tucked under one arm. He'd barely spoken a dozen words to Julian, but it was enough. It was a start. Over the next few weeks, a rhythm began to form. Saturday afternoons became their time, sometimes at the park, sometimes at the small science museum. Once, they sat in Julian's office downtown, and Micah got to draw on the whiteboard while Julian finished a meeting. The boy began to open up, slowly, like a flower unsure of sunlight. He told Julian about his favorite astronaut Mae Jemison. She danced and went to space. About the time his tooth fell out during lunch. About how he didn't like loud thunder at night. Julian, in turn, told him stories too. About the first time he gave a speech and almost threw up. About getting stuck in an elevator on his first day as CEO. About how he used to love stargazing as a kid, lying on the roof of his childhood home with a flashlight and a sketchbook. Micah had laughed at that. You were a kid. Julian had smiled. A long time ago. But yeah, Daniel always stayed nearby, watching from the edges. He never interfered, never hovered too much, but he was there, quietly measuring every moment, protecting the boy he'd raised for 7 years. One evening, as Julian and Daniel stood outside the museum waiting for Micah to finish using the bathroom, Daniel finally spoke the thing they'd both been circling around. You're good with him, he said. Julian looked over, surprised. I wasn't sure I would be. Daniel nodded. I was scared, too. When Elise left Micah with me, I thought, what if I mess him up? But you figure it out, one bedtime story at a time. Julian watched Micah come skipping back toward them, fox in hand, jacket flapping open in the wind. Yeah, Julian said softly, one story at a time. It was the third Saturday in April when everything shifted again. Not with a knock this time, but with a question so small, so unexpected. It cracked something open between all three of them. They were at Julian's penthouse. The first time Daniel had agreed to bring Micah up again since that first overwhelming visit. The living room looked different now. Less like a showroom, more like a home. A few of Micah's drawings were clipped onto the fridge. A small bookshelf Julian had installed in the corner was already half filled with space books, kids' novels, and a plastic rocket. Julian was on the floor with Micah, helping him build a model of the solar system. Daniel was at the kitchen island, sipping tea, watching them with a quiet expression that hovered between cautious and content. Why does Saturn have rings? Micah asked, pressing a thin cardboard loop onto the plastic planet. Julian smiled. That's one of the great mysteries of space. Some scientists think it's leftover pieces from old moons or comets that broke apart, kind of like ... space debris that got caught in orbit. Micah tilted his head. So it's kind of like Saturn's story is made of pieces from other things. Julian paused, stunned for a second. Yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. Micah smiled proudly. Then came the question. It landed in the room with no warning, light as a feather, heavy as truth. Can I call you Dad? Julian froze. He heard Daniel set his cup down behind him. The apartment fell utterly still. Micah wasn't looking at him. He was watching Saturn spin on its plastic axis. Like he'd just asked what time dinner was. Like he didn't know the world had just stopped turning. Julian's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His heart was in his throat. You don't have to, Micah added quickly, almost whispering. Only if you want. I have 2 dads. Now, right. Julian glanced at Daniel, who had stepped closer but said nothing. He was giving Julian the space and the trust to answer it himself. Julian swallowed. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the small model Earth, his voice low and steady. "I would love that," he said. Micah looked up, and for the first time, truly smiled, wide and open, his whole face lighting up like a sun rising behind his eyes. And just like that, something shifted between them. The tentative lines of connection that had slowly grown over the past week suddenly became something else, something real, something permanent. Daniel moved to the couch and sat down beside them. He didn't say anything, but his hand briefly rested on Julian's shoulder. A quiet gesture, a kind of blessing. Later that evening, after dinner and another chapter of Astrodinos, Daniel helped Micah get ready to go home. Julian stood near the doorway, helping Micah with his hoodie. The boy turned suddenly and wrapped his arms around Julian's waist, hugging him tight. "Bye, Dad." Julian knelt, stunned again by how natural it felt to hear it. "Bye, buddy. I'll see you next week." Micah nodded. "Promise." And then they were gone. Julian stood by the door a long time after it closed, his hands in his pockets, the word "Dad" still ringing in his ears. He had never imagined this life, never pictured fatherhood, never thought it would come like this, years late, dropped into his world by grief and secrets and grace. But now that it was here, he couldn't imagine walking away. Later that night, Julian sat at his desk, turning an envelope over in his hand. It was unopened. It had arrived earlier that week. Elise's will. Her attorney had finally reached out, offering Julian a formal copy and a chance to ask questions. He opened it slowly. Inside, among the legal details, was a handwritten note. Just a few lines in Elise's familiar cursive. "If you're reading this, then Micah's found his way back to you. I never stopped thinking about you. I just didn't know how to fix what I broke. Please forgive me. Love him like I know you can. Tell him about the stars." Julian pressed the note to his chest and closed his eyes. He wasn't sure he could forgive Elise entirely, but he knew he could keep her promise. He would love this boy, and he would tell him about the stars. If this part of the story moved you, please consider liking the video and subscribing for more heartfelt, healing stories. Share it with someone who believes in second chances. It started with Saturday afternoons, but somewhere between the shared books and inside jokes, it quietly turned into so much more. Julian, who had once lived by a rigid schedule carved into his calendar like stone, now kept a crayon drawing tucked into his leather briefcase, a purple planet with Micah's crooked name scribbled at the bottom. Meetings were now scheduled around museum exhibits or school art fairs. His driver, Matthew, no longer blinked when Julian asked to swing by a toy store on the way to work. And his executive assistant, Lisa, had learned to block off Friday evenings with a simple calendar note: dinner with Micah and Daniel. It wasn't official. There were no court papers or long-term plans yet, but their rhythms were changing, becoming something steady. But one Friday night, as the city lights blinked through the penthouse windows, Julian stood at the stove trying not to burn spaghetti, while Daniel helped Micah with a school project at the dining table. A cardboard rocket ship was being born from paper towel rolls and glitter glue, and the table looked like a storm of construction paper had passed through. "I forgot glue at home," Micah mumbled, frustrated as the ship's fin drooped. "Wait, here," Julian said, already heading toward his home office. "I think I've got some tape." When he returned, he found Micah sitting on Daniel's lap, his small fingers covered in glitter, his eyes locked on the project like it was a NASA launch. Daniel was calm, patient, guiding without taking over. Julian paused at the doorway, watching them, his son and the man who had raised him with so much care, so much gentleness, and for a moment, Julian felt something he hadn't expected: gratitude, not just for Micah, but for Daniel too. After dinner, when Micah was tucked into the guest room with his fox and a bedtime story playing softly from a nearby speaker, Julian and Daniel sat on the couch with 2 mugs of peppermint tea. "Do you ever miss teaching?" Julian asked, his tone casual, curious. Daniel shrugged, leaning back. "Every day, but raising Micah became everything. Teaching kids math and science felt small compared to teaching him how to tie his shoes or what to say when he was scared of the dark." Julian nodded. "He's a good kid. He's the best thing I've ever done," Daniel said quietly. "But, I won't lie, it's been hard, lonely, sometimes." Julian looked over. "You don't have to do it alone anymore. The words hung in the air, soft but firm. Daniel turned, searching Julian's face. What are you saying? I'm saying, I want to be more than a weekend dad. I want to be in his life, fully. Whatever that looks like, I don't want to take him from you. I just want to be there. For both of you. Daniel blinked slowly. There was no argument in his eyes, just something like relief, and maybe something else, something closer to being seen. I want that too, Daniel said, but it's going to take time and trust. I'm not going anywhere, Julian said. The next week, Micah fell sick, a fever, nothing dangerous, but enough to make him cling to Daniel and cry at night. Daniel called Julian late, apologetic but tired. I just wanted to let you know. He asked for you. Julian didn't hesitate. Do you want me to come over? There was a pause on the other end, then a quiet, yet. Julian arrived an hour later with soup, a stuffed astronaut, and a stack of bedtime books. Micah was curled up on the couch, pale and flushed, still in his pajamas. When he saw Julian, he reached out with a weak smile. Hi, Dad. Julian sat beside him, brushing a hand over his damp curls. Hey, buddy, I heard you weren't feeling great. Micah nodded slowly, his eyes closing again. I had a bad dream. The rocket ship broke. Julian wrapped an arm around him, pulling him gently closer. It's okay. We'll fix it tomorrow. Promise. Daniel watched from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over his chest. Quiet. That night, Julian stayed. He didn't leave until morning. He slept on the couch, waking every couple of hours to check on Micah. And when Daniel came out at 6 a.m., bleary-eyed and grateful, he found Julian making toast in his kitchen like it was the most natural thing in the world. You're good at this, Daniel said softly. Julian smiled. I'm learning from the best. As spring turned to early summer, the three of them began to feel like something new, something not quite defined but undeniably real. They weren't co-parents in the traditional sense. They weren't roommates. They weren't exactly a family, at least not by law. But they were building something, a home where laughter was normal, where dinner didn't come in takeout containers every night, where a little boy could wake up knowing both of his dads would be there, and where two men, one who had built a life out of responsibility, and one who had built his out of love, could look across the table and see not just what they had lost, but what they were finding. Together. By the time June arrived, the air was warmer, and the world felt a little softer. Micah had started calling it our weekends instead of Dad's weekends. Sometimes that meant Julian, sometimes Daniel, but more and more often, it meant all three of them together. There were Saturday picnics in the park, messy art afternoons at Daniel's apartment, and quiet Sunday mornings with pancakes and cartoon reruns in Julian's penthouse. The routines blurred, until lines no longer felt like boundaries, but bridges. It wasn't always perfect. There were moments when Daniel looked hesitant, his eyes shadowed by memories he never voiced, and Julian still had a hard time letting go of control, a lifetime of being the one who solved things, fixed things, led everything. But slowly, they were learning how to make room for each other. One Sunday, they found themselves back at the park, Micah's favorite place. The sky was wide and blue, and Julian had brought along a kite he'd spent hours trying to assemble, only for it to collapse spectacularly when they tried to fly it. Micah laughed so hard he fell backward into the grass, clutching his stomach. Julian groaned, lying beside him. That wasn't supposed to happen. Daniel smirked. Looks like your CEO skills didn't apply to kite construction. Julian turned to Micah. We need a new plan, something I can't mess up. Micah sat up, thoughtful. Can we make paper planes instead? The big kind. Done, Julian said. Lead the mission. Commander Micah. Back at Daniel's apartment, they cleared the table and got to work. Sheets of printer paper became squadrons, markers decorated wings, and for a while, the only sounds were laughter and the occasional crash landing. Later, after Micah fell asleep in the guest room, curled under a spaceship blanket Julian had bought last month, Julian stepped onto the small apartment balcony. Daniel joined him with 2 mugs of tea. They stood side by side, overlooking the street below. For a long while, neither spoke. Then Julian broke the silence. Do you think we're doing this right? Daniel glanced at him. What part? Julian exhaled all of it. The way we're trying to share this. Raise him, without rules. Daniel looked down into his cup. There's no map for this, Julian, no playbook. Elise never planned for it. I didn't plan for it. You sure as hell didn't. But Micah, he paused, then smiled faintly. He's happier than I've seen him in a long time. Julian nodded, the words soaking into him. I keep thinking, he said softly, about how much I missed the years I didn't get. The first time he walked, the first time he said dada, and it wasn't me. Daniel didn't speak right away, but then he turned and said, you didn't miss everything. Julian looked at him. You're here now, Daniel said, and you're really here. That matters more than most people realize. Julian met his gaze. Do you ever regret it, raising someone else's son? Daniel shook his head. Not once. Micah's my son in every way that matters, and now he's yours too. There was something unspoken in that moment. Not jealousy, not rivalry, just understanding. A shared grief for the parts they didn't get to live, and a quiet reverence for the ones they were living now. Julian stared out into the night, his voice quieter. Sometimes I wonder, if Elise had told me back then, would any of this have happened? Would I have tried to raise him on my own? Pushed you away? Daniel's lips curled into a small, sad smile. Maybe, or maybe you would have panicked, hired a nanny, and called me anyway when the diapers got too confusing. Julian laughed, surprised by it. The sound felt like release. They stood in silence again. This time easier. Inside. A soft thump echoed. Micah, rolling over in bed. Daniel stepped back inside to check on him. Julian followed, watching as Daniel gently tucked the blanket back over Micah's shoulder, brushing the boy's hair back with the kind of familiarity that could never be taught. Julian knelt beside him, whispering, "Good night, buddy." Micah stirred, half asleep. "Night, Dad." He didn't say which one, but both men smiled. A few days later, Daniel texted Julian out of the blue. "School's asking for emergency contact updates. What do you want to put?" Julian stared at the screen for a moment, then replied, "Put me down, fully." There was no follow-up, no argument, just a simple, "Okay." It was a small change, a form on paper, but it felt like another door quietly opening. They weren't labeling it. They didn't need to. There was no manual for this kind of fatherhood, no roadmap for what they were building, all three of them. But maybe love didn't need rules. Maybe it only needed time, and choice, and the kind of courage that shows up quietly, like a paper plane launched from kitchen table hands. Drifting, finding its shape, mid-air. And landing exactly where it was meant to. The school newsletter came folded inside Micah's backpack. On a Wednesday afternoon, Daniel pulled it out, absent-mindedly, while unpacking Mika's lunchbox, which still had half a sandwich and 2 untouched carrot sticks. He was about to toss the flyer aside when the bold header caught his eye. "Join us for our annual Father's Day celebration. Bring your dad or dads to school for a morning of crafts, stories, and pancakes." Daniel blinked at the wording. Dads, plural. He read it again, slower this time. Then he glanced over at Micah, who was on the floor drawing stars on the cardboard rocket they were still slowly building together. "Hey buddy," Daniel said, keeping his tone light. "There's a thing at school next Friday. Father's Day. Breakfast." Micah looked up. "With pancakes?" Daniel nodded. "With pancakes." Micah smiled. "Can we go?" Daniel hesitated. "We, as in, just me?" Micah furrowed his brow, like the question didn't make sense. "No, you and Dad." Daniel. It felt something twist in his chest. Not in a painful way, not anymore, but in the kind of way that reminded him how much had changed in such a short time. "You want both of us there?" Micah nodded seriously. "You're both my dads, right?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He just walked over and sat beside him on the floor, gently tapping Micah's nose with the edge of a glittery star. "Yeah," he said softly. "We are." Julian was in a boardroom when the text came through. "Micah wants us both at Father's Day breakfast. You in?" It wasn't a question Julian had expected to receive, and certainly not during a quarterly revenue review. He read the message once, then again, the both sticking in his chest, without even thinking. He replied, "Wouldn't miss it." On the day of the event, the school gym buzzed with excitement, little hands gripping construction paper, the smell of syrup thick in the air, and dozens of dads awkwardly crouching into tiny chairs meant for 7-year-olds. Julian felt completely out of place, dressed in a casual button-up and sneakers, trying not to spill orange juice on his jeans. But when he saw Micah's face light up as he walked in, nerves disappeared. Micah ran up to him with his arms wide. "You came." Julian knelt to hug him. "Of course I came." Daniel was already at the table, saving 2 seats. He smiled as Julian approached and handed him a plastic fork. Brace yourself. The pancakes are ... Very enthusiastic. They sat together, the three of them squeezed into a tiny table surrounded by noise and glitter. Micah introduced them to his teacher, proudly announced that he had 2 dads, and insisted they both help him decorate a foam picture frame with sequins and googly eyes. At one point, Micah slipped away to join a group of kids making crafts. Julian and Daniel stayed behind, sipping lukewarm coffee. She asked if I was the stepdad, Daniel said after a moment, gesturing toward one of the other parents. Julian raised an eyebrow. And what did you say? Daniel smirked. I said no, I'm just one of the dads. Julian nodded slowly. That's fair. They sat in silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Then Julian said, more to the table than to Daniel, I've been thinking, maybe we should formalize it. Custody, legal guardianship, something. Daniel looked up. I know I can't, and wouldn't take anything away from you. Julian added quickly, you're his father. But if anything ever happened to you, Daniel's smile faltered, but he nodded slowly. I've thought about that too. They both looked over at Micah, who was now carefully gluing foam letters onto a paper crown. He wore a focused expression that looked just like Julian's. He deserves to be safe, Daniel said. No matter what happens. Julian turned back to him. We can figure it out. Together. Daniel smiled quietly. Yeah, together. That evening, back at Julian's place, Micah insisted on wearing the paper crown all through dinner. It had a glittery star and crooked foam letters that read, Best Dads. He made them both pose for a photo, Julian on one side, Daniel on the other, their shoulders touching, both laughing at how silly they looked. Micah held the phone up triumphantly after snapping the picture. Now we're a real team. Julian ruffled his hair. We've always been a team. Daniel leaned in. But now we've got a crown to prove it. Later that night, when Micah had fallen asleep on the couch mid-cartoon, Julian gently picked him up and carried him to the guest room, tucking him in with the fox still pressed to his chest. Daniel followed, turning off the lamp. They stood together, in the dim hallway, looking at the small figure curled under the blanket. I used to be scared, Daniel whispered, that the more you got close to him, the more I'd fade into the background. Julian turned to him, surprised. But I'm not anymore, Daniel said. Because he's not replacing anyone. He's just making room. Julian nodded, voice quiet. That's what he's doing for me too. They both stood there a while longer, shoulder to shoulder, listening to Micah's slow, even breathing. Outside, the city hummed on. Inside, a crown made of paper sat on the kitchen table, glitter catching the last of the hallway light. And for the first time in a long time, neither man felt like they were standing in the middle of someone else's story. They were finally writing one together. Julian had never brought anyone into his personal life before. Not really. Not to this degree. Not where soccer cleats were left on the steps of his downtown apartment, or juice boxes filled the bottom shelf of his designer fridge, and definitely not where another man, Daniel, was helping set the table like he belonged there. But that's exactly what happened on Saturday morning. The three of them had just come back from Micah's soccer game, and the smell of pancakes was now as familiar in Julian's kitchen as coffee had once been. Daniel flipped one on the pan. You know, if you keep letting us crash here, Micah might start thinking this is his other home. Julian leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Daniel turned, eyes meeting his for a second. The air between them held something unspoken, not romantic, not dramatic, just real. I meant what I said about guardianship, Julian continued. We don't have to rush anything, but I'd like us to talk to someone, a lawyer, see what the options are. Daniel set the spatula down. You're sure about that? I'm sure Micah deserves all the security we can give him, and you deserve to never feel like you're doing this alone. Daniel swallowed. You're not just saying that because things are going well right now. Julian gave a soft laugh. Daniel, I don't do things just because they're easy. You should know that by now. They shared a look again, one grounded in mutual respect, and in the strange, unfolding trust that had taken root between them. Micah came bursting into the kitchen, moments later, holding up a messy drawing of 3 stick figures, one with glasses, one tall with spiky hair, and one small with a crown. It's us, he declared proudly. My team. Julian knelt beside him. What's the crown for? Because we're the best dads, Micah said, without missing a beat. And I'm the boss of both of you. Daniel burst out laughing. Oh, are you? Micah nodded like it was obvious. Yup, You both gotta listen to me now." That evening, after Daniel and Micah left, Julian found himself standing in the doorway of what used to be the guest room. Now clearly, Micah's a few toys had stayed behind. A tiny bookshelf lined with picture books, and the fox plush resting neatly on the pillow. Julian sat down on the edge of the bed. He didn't often allow himself to pause to feel, but something about the quiet made the weight of recent months pressed against his chest. He had lost years with Micah, years that no one could give back, but what he had now, what he had built with Daniel, and what he was still learning how to nurture, wasn't about reclaiming the past. It was about showing up for the present, even when it was messy, even when it was complicated, especially then. He looked over at the drawing Micah had left behind. On the dresser, 3 stick figures under a rainbow, with hearts in every corner. Julian reached out and carefully placed the drawing in a small frame. Weeks passed, then months. Some days were hectic, juggling work, school drop-offs, Micah's tantrums over broccoli. Other days felt oddly quiet, like the universe was giving them a chance to catch their breath. They went apple picking in the fall, bundled in scarves and flannel. Julian held the ladder while Daniel hoisted Micah to reach the high branches. They went to Micah's first choir recital, where he sang 2 lines, then froze and cried. Daniel hugged him backstage, while Julian wiped away his tears, telling him that even brave kids get scared. They celebrated Micah's birthday with 2 cakes, one homemade by Daniel, lopsided but full of love, and one store-bought by Julian with perfect fondant and a candle shaped like a rocket dot. And through it all, something incredible happened. They stopped counting the days since Julian found out, because now they were counting the days forward, the ones they were building intentionally, patiently, together. One night in early spring, Daniel knocked on Julian's office door, the one in his apartment Julian once guarded like a fortress. "You got a minute?" Julian set his laptop aside. Always. Daniel walked in, holding a folder. "I met with a lawyer," he said. "She explained the paperwork for joint guardianship. It's pretty straightforward, but it would require a statement from both of us." Julian reached for the folder, flipping it open. Daniel added quietly, "It's not that I don't trust you. I do, more than I ever expected to." Julian looked up. "This isn't about trust, it's about doing right by him." They both sat, side by side, signing what needed to be signed. There were no dramatic moments, no swelling music, just 2 men choosing to share the weight of love and responsibility. When they finished, Daniel closed the folder with a soft exhale. "You know what's strange?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "I thought it'd be harder, letting someone in like this, letting you in." Julian nodded, smiling faintly. "I thought it'd be harder too." They sat in silence again, but this time, the quiet was warm, familiar. Julian finally said, "He's lucky, you know, to have a dad like you." Daniel replied without hesitation, "He's lucky to have a second chance with you." As Julian stood in the doorway of Micah's room later that night, watching the rise and fall of his small chest beneath the blankets, he felt something settle inside him. Not closure, not redemption, but a kind of peace. He hadn't gotten everything right, but he'd shown up, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it was late, and somehow, despite the broken beginnings and the hard truths, they had built something whole, something that didn't need to be perfect to be real. The spring air was soft that morning, one of those days when even the wind felt gentle, like the world was trying not to disturb anything fragile. Julian stood outside the elementary school gym, hands in his pockets, watching families pour in for the annual father-child talent show. It was the first time Micah had asked both of them to be there, not as guests, but as his team. Inside, the space buzzed with nervous energy. Kids fidgeted in glittery costumes, fathers adjusted guitars and unicycles, and teachers tried to keep order. Daniel was crouched beside Micah, near the stage steps, smoothing down the boy's spiky hair. Julian watched them for a moment, watched how Micah leaned easily into Daniel's side, giggling at something whispered in his ear. Then Micah turned and spotted him. "Julian, come on." He ran over, grabbing Julian's hand. "We're up next." Julian chuckled, letting himself be pulled toward the stage. "Are we really doing this?" "You promised," Micah said with mock sternness. "No backing out now." Their act wasn't elaborate, just Micah telling knock-knock jokes while Daniel played soft background music on the ukulele, and Julian, very awkwardly, juggled beanbags. It was messy and chaotic. Micah forgot half the punchlines. Julian dropped the beanbags twice, Daniel's ukulele was slightly out of tune, but the laughter, it echoed, loud and real. Even the teachers were clapping by the end. Micah beamed as they took their bow, one hand in each of theirs. "I told you we'd be awesome," he whispered. Julian smiled, his chest so full it ached. "You were right." Later that afternoon, back at Daniel's small house, the one Julian had come to think of as the warmest place he'd ever known, they sat on the porch steps as Micah napped inside. Daniel sipped iced tea and nudged Julian with his shoulder. "You juggled." "I tried to juggle," Julian corrected. "There's a difference." Daniel laughed. "You're a CEO and a dad now. You're always juggling." Julian looked out at the quiet street, the soft sway of the trees. "I used to think I had to choose between work and everything else. That being great at one meant failing the other." "You don't believe that anymore." Julian paused. "I believe life's not about balance. It's about presence and intention." He glanced at Daniel. "And forgiveness for what we didn't know, for the time we lost." Daniel looked at him, eyes gentle. "We did lose time." "Yeah, but maybe we found something even better because of it." Daniel nodded slowly, and they sat in the stillness, two men who had come from opposite ends of a broken truth, now choosing to build something honest from it. Weeks later, Julian opened the door of his apartment to find Daniel, holding a thick envelope. "I got the final papers today," Daniel said. "It's official. We're co-guardians now." Julian took the envelope, fingers tracing the embossed seal. "It didn't feel like winning. It felt like healing." Daniel added. "Micah asked if we could frame it. He said it's like our team certificate." Julian smiled, heart swelling. "Then we'll frame it." One evening, a few months after everything had settled, Julian stood at the edge of a school fundraiser, watching parents mingle and kids run wild under string lights. A man approached him, older, with tired eyes and a soft voice. "Mr. Blake." Julian turned. "Yes, I'm sorry to bother you. I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "My daughter's in Micah's class. She told me how he talks about his dads, how proud he is, how safe he feels." The man hesitated. "I'm a single dad too. I was scared I couldn't do this right, but hearing about you two, it gave me hope." Julian felt a lump rise in his throat. He offered his hand. "You were doing it right. Every day you show up, you're doing it right." The man smiled, tears in his eyes, and walked away. Julian stood still for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle. Then he turned, and there was Micah, chasing fireflies with Daniel, laughter rising like music. His boy, their boy, whole, loved, brave, and Julian. Julian had opened the door too late once, but this time, he'd made sure it would never close again. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you even a little, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. Every view helps us keep telling stories that heal. Until next time, take care of your heart and those who hold it gently.